My name is Michael Diaz. I teach drawing at University of Central Oklahoma in Edmond. I live in Oklahoma City and I've been drawing my whole life. I started really actively pursuing a career in art about 10 years ago and now I've become a professor. I work in all sorts of drawing and painting mediums. It's primarily acrylic and charcoal, but I work in all sorts of different stuff, especially copper plate etchings, one of which is included in the 24 works on paper this year. The big idea I'm going to talk about today with you guys is the grid and measurement and proportions, and I'm going to show you how to measure using a string. So when you're learning to draw from nature, it's imperative that you learn how to translate 3 dimensions into 2, right? In order to do that, we have to learn how to look at things in terms of a 2-dimensional grid, right? Vertical and horizontal lines. So this assignment, this exercise, helps teach that to people, right? So when you're doing this exercise, we're gonna use a string to measure. We wanna hold the string completely vertical and horizontal to sort of mimic the grid, right? Just like a vertical and horizontal lines to help us translate what we're looking at in 3 dimensions into 2. Right, and some artists that have really made this the central aspect of their work is like Ewan Uglo, Alberto Giacometti, and specifically Anne Gale. If you look at some of Anne Gale's drawings, you can see how she uses horizontal and vertical lines to help compare points on a subject. Right, and that's kind of like we're doing in a beginning drawing class is teaching people how to look at something in terms of points and not parts, right? That's a sort of way to shift someone into thinking, into looking at the world like an artist. So this is why I teach this assignment. It's a way of beginning to teach this to people that even, that don't believe they can draw, right? This is a really simple way to start looking at things in terms of points and not parts. So when drawing from nature, there's 2 essential questions that you need to ask before you begin, right? First off, what am I drawing? And second, where will it be placed on my paper, right? That then leads to a third question of how tall to how wide is my subject, right? What area of the paper is it going to take up? These seem like very simple questions, but often they go ignored, and that's when you see drawings that feel awkward, the proportions are off, right? Often what you'll see in beginning artists is that they'll have feet of a figure running off, the head running off, the figure's just awkwardly placed to the left or right. It doesn't feel very thought out or intentional. These questions make it intentional, right? So that's why we start here. Again, this exercise helps you build those skills, right? Because you can't do it without thinking about those questions. So those lines that Anne Gale uses, right? I like to call those reference lines. Sometimes they might be called construction lines or organizational lines. I'm not exactly sure what Anne Gale calls them, but she would understand what I'm talking about, right? Reference lines are imaginary lines that are used to compare points on a form or in space. They don't actually exist in physical reality, right? But we actually are gonna draw them on our paper, right? To help us, again, think in terms of points and not parts, and to relate the points of our subject on the paper. So I call this assignment the panel because we're using a wooden panel normally. I'm in a slightly smaller space, so I'm going to use a sheet of white copy paper today. That's what you could do if you were doing this exercise at home. In my drawing 1 classes, this becomes the literal foundation, right, that we use to draw and then build stuff on. So I'll actually stack stuff on to continue this exercise moving forward. The materials I'm using for this are just charcoal pencils. I like to use these General's soft charcoal pencils. I also have red pastel pencils. I use this to draw the reference lines to separate them from the black contour lines that I'll be drawing. I use soft pastels. I like the New Pastel brand like these, but any soft pastels would do for this. And then the only other things you really need, drawing pad and a ruler. I'm using a large drawing pad, so I have just a wooden yardstick and a piece of string, right? Just thin cotton twine will do. Anything that you can see will work, right? As long as it's not super thick. I'm just gonna start with this pink pastel here. Again, I wanted to sort of touch both sides and the bottom. It doesn't have to be right on top of it, but pretty close to it. Right, so it's gonna be this wide, right? But that begs a question, how tall is the panel gonna be, right? How much vertical space on my paper is it gonna take up? So I'm just gonna use the pink pastel to block it in. Again, not drawing any diagonals at this point. This is just a vertical and horizontal rectangle that sort of summarizes the two-dimensional space, right? The area on my paper that panel, right? Or in this case, a piece of paper, is gonna exist with it. I'm gonna take some time to nicely color in my sheet of paper. This pastel creates a really nice surface for the charcoal pencils. Right? You could do this with graphite if you wanted to. And again, the pink is arbitrary color. It's not anything it doesn't have anything to do with the actual color of the panel. It's just for me to see clearly on this piece of paper that's sort of gray. So it's arbitrary color, right? As opposed to local color, which would be the actual color of the panel out there. I'm just using the side of my hand to sort of work the excess pastel into the paper. And there we go. Right, that's my block, and that's what I think the panel will exist within. So next, what I want to do is use the string to measure what I'm seeing, right? How tall to how wide is the panel in my line of sight? For this, I'm going to use a string. Right? I like to tie a knot in the middle of it. It just helps me understand where the halfway point is. And I'm just going to take this string and pull it out here, right? And use it to measure the panel in my line of sight. Notice that I'm locking my elbows out, and I'm actually going to pinch it in my line of sight, right, in order to get my measurements, right? I'm gonna measure the height into the width to find the proportion of the panel out there, right? So I start by moving my string, again, completely vertically, right? I'm gonna put my bottom thumb on that bottom point, right? The lowest point that I see out there on that panel, and then move my hands over like they're on train tracks, right? Completely horizontally. It takes a little bit of practice. Notice I have one eye closed. Really helps me see clearly. And then I just kind of go back and forth and check, right? That is the height of the panel in my line of sight, right? You want to imagine that you're touching a plate of glass, right? The picture plane out here. So now that I have my height, I'm gonna turn it on its side and measure across horizontally to see if this is 1 tall, how wide is it? So if it's 1 tall, turn it on its side. You can measure from the right or left. Doesn't matter. I'm gonna put my right thumb on the right. Now I'm gonna move my right thumb where my left thumb is and count. 1, 2. Okay, it's about 1 tall to 1 3/4 wide, right? 1 tall to 1 3/4 wide. Don't try to get too accurate here, right? You're not gonna be able to do 1.678. Right, you're not gonna be that accurate. The string is meant to help you get in the ballpark, right? But at the end of the day, you're gonna have to trust your eye. So now that I have my ratio, I'm just gonna write it down on my sheet of paper out of the way, right? So I'm gonna say it was 1 to 1 3/4, right? Just about, more or less, right? So that's the ratio I saw out there. Now I wanna make my block match that, right? So this is comparative. We're never taking the string and then coming in and measuring something on here, right? Because then I would end up with a very small panel, right? I want a large panel. So I measure the height of my block. I made it this tall, right? To, wow, look at that. 1 tall to 1 and just a little bit, right? This is way too tall. I can't fit more of the height into the width. So I just start making guesses. Well, what if it was this tall, right? 1, 2, oh, now I made it a little too short. Let me try again, right? Add a little bit more height to it. 1, 2, almost there. This is just like a little playing game. You're just taking guesses, right? A little bit more. That's about what I saw right there, right? So this block really should be that tall, right? I'm gonna take my red pencil here and draw a reference line, right? So that's what that is. I'm now gonna cut this off like it's a block of clay, and I'm just cutting this bit off. Boom, right? I'm gonna go ahead and just clarify the sides too, right? When I drew that block, it was a little off. That's fine, right? Notice that I'm drawing the lines completely through the paper. If you were to continue this exercise on, having those reference lines all the way through the paper help you draw other things on top of the panel, right? Or beside the panel. All right. Okay, so from this point, I know that the panel is gonna exist within this red box, right? This could just lop off. I'm not gonna worry about erasing it or anything, right? These aren't mistakes, right? This is the process of me looking at something, right? So I'm not gonna worry about when things aren't quite right or they change. I'm gonna embrace that. So from here, what we need to do next is figure out, well, where these points are at, right? I know my low point will be on this line somewhere. My furthest point to the left will be somewhere over here. Furthest point to the right, somewhere over there. High point somewhere over here, right? So I'm just gonna make a guess. I think my low point is somewhere right about there, right? I'm just making a little dash or tick mark, whatever makes sense to you, right? I think my furthest point to the left is somewhere there. High point is somewhere around there. Furthest point to the right, somewhere about there, right? Now I'm gonna use the string to check that, right? The string is to give me feedback. That's why I use this. So when you go to measure, you wanna use the height as your unit of one, right? Your unit of one. We could use different things to measure, but it could kind of get complicated. In order to keep it simple, we're gonna always return to that height, right? So again, bottom thumb on that bottom point, move over like my hands are on train tracks, drop my top thumb, right? I can kind of move that knot into the middle. Boom, this is my unit of one, right? This is what I'm gonna use to measure everything. So what I wanna check for is, to start off with, is how far over is my low point from the left, all right? And it's real easy. I put my left thumb on that point and then drop my hands, just like that. And wow, look at that. It's just about halfway. It might be slightly further to the right, just ever so slightly further to the right. So again, I kind of take my height here, about in the middle, all right? Just kind of play with it for a second. Come over here. Oh wow, look at how much it's gonna move, right? It moves all the way over here, right? That's where I thought it was. This is where it's actually at. And I'm just gonna make that mark a little bit darker so I can keep track. This is my guess. That's where it's actually at. All right. Then I just repeat that for the high point. Again, come to my unit of one, bottom thumb on bottom point, move over, top thumb down, double check. This time, since my high point is closer to the right, I'm gonna measure from the right. Right thumb there, thumb up. Pretty much the same thing, right? Slightly more to the left than halfway, right? So almost halfway, but slightly more to the left. So put my knot in the middle. That's why having the knot's pretty helpful. Right thumb there. And again, look, it's gonna move just a little bit. Not as much as last time, but it's gonna move to right about there. Okay. Now, for the left and rightmost points, easy, okay? You're gonna come back to your height. Notice that I take my extra string and just kind of wrap it around my hands, right? If you have too much string here for what you're measuring. Have my height, my unit of one, in my line of sight. And now I'm just gonna keep moving on to the left, or I'm sorry, in this case, I'm gonna go to the right. Right? And when I move to the right, I see that right point just about halfway, right? Just the way I happen to be set up on this panel, everything's more or less halfway. You might see different things, right? Depending on how your panel's set up. So don't think that you're getting the wrong answer if you're not getting the same measurements that I'm getting, right? So it's just about halfway. Look how low I put it, right? I mean, halfway is more or less, you know, right about there. It was slightly underneath halfway, ever so slightly. Something like right about there, right? And repeat for the left, right? Again, find my height and then come over to the left, right? And this one is slightly above half, right? Slightly above half. So, if I look at halfway, it's slightly above. It was right about there, right? Now I've measured for all my 4 points. At this point, are we ready to actually draw a diagonal? Now that I have all my points measured out, I can finally draw diagonals, right? Again, the reason we don't start off with diagonals is that it's really easy to be slightly off, and what we're trying to do in the beginning artist is train the mind to look vertically and horizontally, right? In order to learn how to translate 3 dimensions into 2. So now I'm gonna connect this using my charcoal pencil and actually see what I got. Let's take this again. Notice how I'm holding my pencil slightly further back, right? I'm not putting down a ton of pressure. I don't want to like dig into the paper because I might need to erase and push back and move things around, right? And again, they're not mistakes. I'm using the process of drawing to help me see. I don't want to commit to something too early because it might be slightly off. Like I was saying before, the string is not a perfect science. There is no perfect way to measure, but it gets you pretty close. All right, now at this point, I'd say, you know, back up a little bit, take a look, and see what your shape looks like. Does that look like the shape you see out there? You know, it's pretty close. I'm definitely in the ballpark, closer than I could have got just using my eye, but I think some things need to move around. One other way that you can use a string is to draw reference lines through your individual points, right? So I could draw a reference line through my high point, right? Vertical line coming straight down. Right? Again, I'm gonna pull it all the way through, just get in the habit of pulling it all the way through. And when you go to draw something else, right? When we draw the panel at UCO, we put an actual figure model on top of this in drawing too, and these lines would help you draw that model. And I can put horizontal ones coming across, and ooh, I see something that'll probably help me change this panel right here. Right, I really doubt that those two lines are that close together. Right, it's unlikely. It's possible, right? Sometimes points line up. Generally speaking, points are not going to line up in space, right? Our brains like to make things like line up and be perfect. Nature is not perfect most of the time, right? So I'm going to use my string just to compare points, right? So I'm not even measuring here. I'm just holding a big horizontal. I'm going to touch the rightmost point, and wow, when I see that, yeah, I see that the gap between the two is actually slightly wider. So when I measured, I was a little bit off. Not far, but a little bit. So I saw this gap being a little bit bigger. I'm gonna try moving, you know, I'm actually gonna try moving this one up. I might need to move this one down. Let's see, right? So maybe I need to move that one up that much, right? You see the difference there, that I'm gonna move it up that much. Again, at this point, we're playing with the shape. Little movements, we're just fooling with it. Not mistakes, right? We're just playing with the shape to help train our eye. Notice I'm not even gonna erase. I'm just gonna redraw the line straight up. Right, again, do that. And then to help me see the shape a little bit better, I'm gonna use my pastel to push the lines back, the old lines. Right? Again, don't think of this as like a mistake and that you're getting rid of a mistake. Oh no, I messed up. You're using the process of drawing to help you see. And the reason why we work with these materials in particular, rather than, you know, graphite or something else, is that I'm never gonna erase that line, right? It's never gonna come out of the newsprint here, and that's on purpose, right? This shows me the history of the drawing, which is something that I encourage and push my students to accept and to work with and to build into their final artworks. But it also sort of gives you an undo button, right? Like, let's say I actually needed to move that one down. I can see the history of the drawing and say, well, let me just retrace it for my lines, push back the other ones, you know, so I can go back to what I had before, right? Again, now I kind of sit back and go, okay, that is actually looking more like what I see out there. I see that this angle wasn't as steep as that. And again, I can kind of check that by putting a big horizontal string up to my high point and seeing that, what is this negative shape here, right? This negative shaped triangle. It looks pretty much like that when I look out here. Right? More or less, looks like that. So I'm gonna leave this area alone. I actually think that was right. You know, now I could probably move this one down, maybe just a little bit more. Not a lot. I think it just needs to move that. Sometimes a movement of just that, you know, 1/4 inch, even 1/8 of an inch will make something look, it'll be the difference between it looking right and looking off. At this point too, if you wanted to, you could start using different colors. Like, you know, sometimes I'll bring in a different color to kind of cut off the outside of the panel and help me see it a little bit better. You know, and just take your time to, again, do it with some finesse. I'm gonna sort of softly move it out that way. And maybe I'll keep the panel pink. So that's how you draw the panel. Again, this is just the beginning step, right? An exercise for beginning freshmen or high school students. We can take this much further, right? Here's some examples of it being taken further, both my student work and my own work. Just to recap, I talked about the grid. I spoke about reference lines, right? Imaginary lines used to compare points on a form. I talked about arbitrary color, right? And proportions. You can come see my work and many other great ones at the 24 Works on Paper exhibition. It's in many locations throughout the state. Check the OVAC website to see where it's currently at. And thank you for watching.